All right, everyone, now that we've looked at dependent clauses, let's talk about punctuation and style in complex sentences. And before we get into the details, let's just quickly answer, why does punctuation even matter? Well, first, it guides the reader and clarifies meaning in complex sentences. Even small changes like commas can change interpretation, and overall it helps your writing flow clearly and more professionally. So by the end of this video, you'll see how commas work differently with relative clauses, complement clauses, adverbial clauses, and in embedded structures, and why those differences matter. Let's start first with relative clauses. Now, in the last video, I told you there were two types, restrictive and non-restrictive, and we'll explore those right now. So restrictive relative clauses are essential. They tell you which noun you mean. For example, the student who studied hardest passed the exam. Notice how no commas are used here, because who studied hardest is essential information. It tells us, or it clarifies for us which student we mean. Non-restrictive clauses, on the other hand, add extra information. For example, my dog, which hates baths, hid under the bed. Notice the commas. Well, that's because which hates baths is extra information. It doesn't change which dog we mean. So you can see how adding or removing commas highlights information that's essential or non-essential, and that's one reason why punctuation matters. Now, we just talked about relative clauses, which are a type of dependent clause, but generally for all dependent clauses, when it comes to punctuation, we want to look at placement. So there's the beginning of the sentence occurrence, right? Because it was raining, we stayed inside. Because it was raining, as we know, is a dependent clause, and we stayed inside is an independent clause. And we would use a comma after the dependent clause because it occurs at the beginning. However, if the dependent clause occurs at the end of the sentence, for example, we stayed inside because it was raining, we don't need to use a comma there. So a general rule of thumb is that if it's an introductory dependent clause, it usually uses a comma. If it's an ending dependent clause, oftentimes there's no comma. And this might seem small, but it affects readability and how smoothly your sentence actually flows. So in the last video, we talked about the three types of dependent clauses. We started with relative clauses, and then we talked about complement clauses. So I also want to mention them here while we're talking about punctuation. So remember, complement clauses act like nouns, subjects or objects, and usually no commas are needed because they are essential units, essential clauses to the sentence. So the only reason I'm highlighting it here is so that you have an idea of how this specific type of dependent clause fits inside the conversations of punctuation, and really you don't need punctuation with complement clauses. Adverbial clauses, though, is a different story. Adverbial clauses, remember, act like adverbs. They modify verbs, adjectives, or other adverbs. And comma rules for adverbial clauses depend on position, like I explained before. So if it's an introductory adverbial clause, you usually need a comma. For example, again, because it was raining, we stayed inside. But if it's an ending adverbial clause, usually there's no comma. We stayed inside because it was raining. Beyond just following punctuation rules, you can also make stylistic choices. You can use commas to highlight extra information or create pauses. You can use commas to decide how to structure your clauses to emphasize the main idea. And you can use commas to combine clauses strategically to vary sentence rhythm in your writing. For example, although she was tired, Maria finished her essay. And the emphasis in this example is on the contrast of these two clauses, right? However, Maria finished her essay although she was tired, and here the emphasis is on Maria finishing the essay. Both sentences are correct, but the placement of the dependent clause changes what the reader focuses on. So just remember these key points. Commas signal extra information or are omitted for essential information. So we're back to talking about non-restrictive clauses and restrictive clauses. With non-restrictive clauses, commas signal extra information, but with restrictive clauses, they're omitted because it's essential information. Also remember that introductory clauses usually get commas and ending clauses often don't. And finally, clause placement affects style and emphasis, so think about what you want the reader to notice when you're formulating your sentences. Correct punctuation in complex sentences guides the reader, clarifies meaning, and makes your writing look polished and professional. So paying attention to these details will help your sentences flow more naturally and read clearly.